not gonna lie. I sure enjoyed it.
Where'd you go?
I went to North Carolina, and it was, I went to the mountains. It was great. It was really, really awesome. The weather was like 70 degrees. It was perfect. It was fantastic. But anyway, it's good to get out of town, I'm not gonna lie. I would say I missed y'all, but maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit. All right. Okay, so let's see. Jonathan Edwards. Okay, jot this down. Super, super important. It's going to be on that midterm that I keep making reference to. So Jonathan Edwards is the most famous of the Puritan ministers. Okay? Grayson, you look confused. You okay? All right, Jonathan Edwards, most famous of the Puritan ministers. He is one of the leaders of the Great Awakening, and you want to capitalize that, the Great Awakening. Now, some of you guys who are in a push, which is the AP history class, may know what the Great Awakening is. Is there anybody in here who knows what the Great Awakening is? Okay, well, the name gives us a hint. It is, and you do want to jot this down, a religious revival. A religious revival which swept through the colonies in the mid-1700s. The Great Awakening. Religious revival that swept through the colonies in the mid-1700s. Now, the background reading on Jonathan Edwards talks about that, but again, that was Friday or Thursday, so maybe you don't remember. Now, why would a religious revival be aptly named the Great Awakening?
Because they realized
Yeah, I mean, revive. What do you do when you revive someone? You wake them up, okay? So Jonathan Edwards' deal is he wants to bring people back to God, back to like that Puritan faith. But here's the thing. You figured out towards the end of that sermon that even though he is Puritan, he doesn't necessarily believe all of those Puritan, those strict Puritan beliefs, right? What's the one that, A, it's the one that's probably the most memorable, and B, what's the one that he clearly has broken with? Like, what is the one belief that he's pulled away from? Predestination. How do we know from that sermon that he does not necessarily believe full-heartedly in predestination?
Didn't he say at one point that you have a choice?
Yes, absolutely. Good, Braden. You're kind of on fire today. All right, so jot that down, folks. At the end of that long sermon, where he's basically scared everybody, he says, "But sinner, today you have a day of mercy," right? You can choose to come back to Jesus. And that's just not part of that whole predestination, that's not a word. Predestination thing. Because, Amelia, if you believe in predestination, what do you believe?
That you're just going to go one way and there's
One way? Go ahead.
Like, you're just going to go one way and there's something
Yep.
getting in the way of it.
Yeah, you're going to go to heaven or hell and you can't do anything about it. So it's very obvious that that's one of those strict beliefs that falls away, and it's pretty clear why it would fall away. Who wants to believe in something like that, right? I mean, we as humans want to believe that we've got free will and we've got choice. I think that is incredibly important, okay? Especially in the American colonies where you have that whole kind of rebellious spirit that, you watched that video yesterday and it talks about how the people who came over to colonize the New World, they were all looking for some kind of freedom, whether it was religious freedom or freedom to, make something of themselves that they were not able to do in the old countries, in the old world. We are kind of built on this spirit of rebellion. I mean, the war that breaks from England is called the Revolution. And a revolution is a revolt. During the Revolution, the British called us traitors. Rebels, right? So we like free will. We like our free will. All right, let's talk about some of the imagery. What are some of the images that you remember from the piece? I know you don't have it in front of you, but you remember from the piece that you also maybe put in your Google form. He's talking about hell, and he's talking about all these things that are kind of like lingering beneath us. What ideas? Yeah.
Talked about God's mercy being like a fiery pit.
Not the mercy, his wrath.
His wrath.
Yeah. It's called, and y'all jot the name of the sermon down, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So the God that he speaks of is not the kind, benevolent, merciful God that, we like to think of. It is a wrathful God. What is wrath, by the way? Anger, yeah. I mean, he is angry. And what has made God angry, according to Jonathan Edwards in this sermon? What angers God? Sin, our behavior. Okay, is this coming back to y'all? Because you're all looking a little misty. All right, so let me just read a couple of passages, some of my fave. Okay, let's see. There is a world of misery, a lake of burning brimstone extended under you. So, he looks out at the congregation and he even says things like, we don't even know why he hasn't pulled that trap door and you haven't sunk into that fiery pit as you've been sitting here. I mean, he really puts his congregation on the spot. Now, folks, I do want you to know that since he is a minister that leads revival, he's not just giving this sermon like once to his church. He is traveling and giving this sermon over and over again. By the way, the actual sermon, the full sermon, is pages and pages long. I cut it down to the parts that I thought were really important. So no telling how long it actually took him to give that sermon, okay? He says, your wickedness makes you, as it were, heavy as lead. So the more you sin, the heavier you become and more likely to what? To sink. That's right. There are black clouds of God's wrath hanging directly over your head. So we have the imagery of the fire. We have the fire's beneath us, but the black clouds are hanging above us. We have the imagery of the storms, right? Full of dreadful storm, big with thunder. And if it were not for the restraining of hand of God, it would immediately burst upon you. The wrath of God is like great waters that are dammed for the present. Okay, so I'll never forget 2005 Katrina. Okay, now were y'all born? Y'all were born, weren't you? Yeah, you were just young. So Hurricane Katrina hits, and we get all these folks from New Orleans who are seeking refuge, right? And I'll never forget that particular fall, the day I was teaching this piece, I had a girl come into my class who, lost her home in Katrina. And I remember reading this and thinking, God, I can't believe, bless her heart. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't just change my lesson plans for that day. I didn't have time. And so I had to read, the wrath of God is like great waters that are dammed. For the present, they increase more and more and rise higher and higher. And the longer the stream is stopped, the more rapid and mighty is its course. When once it is finally let loose, it just kind of pours out over everything. And I'm thinking, Lord, that's exactly what happened down in Katrina without the wrath of God part, right? It was nature. But so we got the flood waters. That's another one. Here's one. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart. Okay, write this one down, because this one I want you to remember. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and justice bends the arrow at your heart. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and justice bends the arrow at your heart. Okay? And then you don't have to write this, but it goes on to say, it's only the pleasure of God that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Wow. Okay. So let's break that one down. Anybody use that one in the Google form that you did? You probably used the fire and the water, but did you use the bow and arrow? Okay, so I wanted to make sure that you understood this one. So if I've got, all right, here's Kayvon, right? And Kayvon has sinned. He's done some bad things, all right? And I got this bow and arrow that's aimed at him, right? And the bow and arrow is God's, what is it, wrath? Yeah. What is it that holds the arrow? Look at your line that you just wrote down. Justice. What does that mean if I let loose that arrow and it's made drunk with Kayvon's blood? Not really, Kayvon, because you're a good guy. Okay? But what does that mean if he says justice holds the bow? Think about it. Yeah, this is, if that arrow is let loose and made drunk with Kayvon's blood, it is just. That's what he's saying. Okay? It would be the right thing because he's been doing bad stuff. It's pretty scary. And he says, the heavier we sin, the heavier we become, the more likely that we are going to plunge into that eternal pit. Pretty scary stuff. By the way, what is the tone of this work? Threatening. Yeah. What emotion is he trying to manipulate? Like, what is he playing off of when giving this sermon? Fear. Might want to jot that down too. You want to remember that as well. He plays people's fears. Okay? All right, and finally, this is my absolute favorite. So take notes on this too. He says, we are like a little spider that's being dangled on that little web over what? Do you remember? If we are dangled over the flames of hell, right? We're like a little spider that's being held over a flame. Do y'all remember this? Somebody besides Braden needs to give me some feedback because y'all are making me think you didn't read it carefully.
I get bonus points.
I don't know, maybe. Emily, do you remember this? The little spider?
I don't remember this part, but I did read it.
What about you, Anna Kate? You remember the spider? Wow. Y'all are making me a little concerned for you, okay? So he says that we're like a little spider that's dangling over a flame, right? And the angrier God becomes, the more likely it is that that flame is going to, jump up and singe that little thread that holds that spider over the flame. Well, in this analogy, we're the spider. And of course, what's the flame?
That's rough.
Yep, and of course the fire itself is hell, okay? So he plays off people's fears. All right, let's talk about, man, I'm really concerned about y'all not remembering all this stuff. All right, let's talk about a couple of things. And some of this is pretty obvious. So, pasta. Everybody loves pasta, right? This is a way to remember some of the things that we'll look at when we read these different folks, okay? PASTA stands for purpose. What is the purpose? What is Jonathan Edwards trying to do, really at all costs?
He's trying to get people to turn to God.
Yes. He wants people to convert, which again reminds us that this is not someone who believes wholeheartedly, at least, in predestination, okay? So, and y'all might want to jot this down too, because this is going to be important. What is that? An acronym? I think that's an acronym, right? So the purpose is to bring people to God. Therefore, the audience is who? Yeah, the congregation, those that are sinners. So I guess that's everybody, because we're all sinners, right? What is the subject? What's the title? Yeah, so the subject would be the wrathful God. Okay, we know what the tone is. The tone is very intense, kind of scary, threatening. And author's bias is always a bit tricky. So what is he biased, I guess, against? Say it again. Yeah, predestination. And in this piece, I mean sin. I mean, he hates some sinners, right? Now, here's the interesting thing about Jonathan Edwards. He, and you don't have to write this down, but I always found this interesting because he's said to be like a rational, reasonable, kind human being and a very effective minister. This particular piece is kind of out of character for the rest of his sermons, but it is, of course, his most famous because of the imagery, right? I mean, it's just real hard. Well, or maybe it's not so hard to forget some of those images because y'all forgot some of them and you just read it on Thursday, right? Even if you forgot the little spider or maybe even the bow and arrow, you definitely remember like the rivers of flame. Okay, I mean, that's hard to forget. So growing up in my church, when I was little, of course, I'm old, y'all. I grew up in the 70s. I remember hearing what were called fire and brimstone sermons. Okay? I remember sitting in church and hearing sermons that if they were not quite this scary, they still were pretty darn scary. And I remember, being frightened for my soul, for my everlasting, life. Do you think that this particular sermon would go over well in your church today? I just don't know that this is the way we view things anymore. I imagine if you had a visiting minister come to your church and speak on this subject with these images, I mean, people would start looking around and catching each other's eyes. And it's so over the top that it might even be something that was not effective, might be ineffective, because it's too much. Now, when he was around, it was incredibly effective. It scared people, went into hysterics. They fainted. One thing it said that he did, and this would be really weird, y'all. It is said that he gave the sermon, not like me, like I talk with my hands, right? But he gave the sermon while looking at one spot on the back wall, or if it were outdoors, one spot in the distance where he stared and presented it in kind of a monotone voice. And to me, that would freak me out more than probably someone who was very animated. Does that make sense? But he was incredibly effective, and he is the leader of the Great Awakening. So you're going to need to remember the name of the sermon, some of these key images, and that he was one of those ministers that led the Great Awakening. Okay? All right, set that aside. And I'm going to turn this thing off because I can film more of this later, but that's enough for that one second.